Section 3 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 5, by Henry Gray. The Larynx, Part 2. Interior of the Larynx. The cavity of the larynx, cavum laryngis, extends from the laryngeal entrance to the lower border of the cricoid cartilage, where it is continuous with that of the trachea. It is divided into two parts by the projection of the vocal folds, between which is a narrow triangular fissure or chink, the rima glottis. The portion of the cavity of the larynx above the vocal folds is called the vestibule. It is wide and triangular in shape, its base or anterior wall presenting, however, about its center the backward projection of the tubercle of the epiglottis. It contains the ventricular folds, and between these and the vocal folds are the ventricles of the larynx. The portion below the vocal folds is at first of an elliptical form, but lower down it widens out, assumes a circular form, and is continuous with the tube of the trachea. The entrance of the larynx is a triangular opening, wide in front, narrow behind, and sloping obliquely downward and backward. It is bounded in front by the epiglottis, behind by the apices of the arytenoid cartilages, the corniculate cartilages, and the interarytenoid notch, and on either side by a fold of mucous membrane, enclosing ligamentous and muscular fibers, stretched between the side of the epiglottis and the apex of the arytenoid cartilage. This is the aryepiglottic fold, on the posterior part of the margin of which the cuneiform cartilage forms a more or less distinct whitish prominence, the cuneiform tubercle. The ventricular folds, plici ventricularis, superior or false vocal cords, are two thick folds of mucous membrane, each enclosing a narrow band of fibrous tissue, the ventricular ligament, which is attached in front to the angle of the thyroid cartilage immediately below the attachment of the epiglottis, and behind to the anterolateral surface of the arytenoid cartilage, a short distance above the vocal process. The lower border of this ligament, enclosed in mucous membrane, forms a free crescentic margin, which constitutes the upper boundary of the ventricle of the larynx. The vocal folds, plici vocalis, inferior or true vocal cords, are concerned in the production of sound, and enclose two strong bands, named the vocal ligaments, ligamenta vocalis, inferior thyroarytenoid. Each ligament consists of a band of yellow elastic tissue attached in front to the angle of the thyroid cartilage and behind to the vocal process of the arytenoid. Its lower border is continuous with the thin lateral part of the conus elasticus. Its upper border forms the lower boundary of the ventricle of the larynx. Laterally, the vocalis muscle lies parallel with it. It is covered medially by mucous membrane, which is extremely thin and closely adherent to its surface. The ventricle of the larynx, ventriculus laryngis Morgagni, laryngeal sinus, is a fusiform fossa, situated between the ventricular and vocal folds on either side, and extending nearly their entire length. The fossa is bounded above by the free crescentic edge of the ventricular fold, below by the straight margin of the vocal fold, laterally by the mucous membrane covering the corresponding thyroarytenoideus. The anterior part of the ventricle leads up by a narrow opening into a cecal pouch of mucous membrane of variable size called the appendix. The appendix of the laryngeal ventricle, appendix ventriculi laryngis, laryngeal saccule, is a membranous sac placed between the ventricular fold and the inner surface of the thyroid cartilage, occasionally extending as far as its upper border or even higher. It is conical in form and curved slightly backward. On the surface of its mucous membrane are the openings of 60 or 70 mucous glands, which are lodged in the submucous areolar tissue. This sac is enclosed in a fibrous capsule, continuous below with the ventricular ligament. Its medial surface is covered by a few delicate muscular fasciculi, which arise from the apex of the arytenoid cartilage and become lost in the aryepiglottic fold of mucous membrane, Laterally it is separated from the thyroid cartilage by the thyroepiglotticus. These muscles compress the sac and express the secretion it contains upon the vocal folds to lubricate their surfaces. The rima glottis is the elongated fissure or chink between the vocal folds in front and the bases and vocal processes of the arytenoid cartilages behind. It is therefore subdivided into a larger anterior intramembranous part (glottis vocalis), which measures about 3/5 of the length of the entire aperture, and a posterior intercartilaginous part (glottis respiratoria). Posteriorly it is limited by the mucous membrane passing between the arytenoid cartilages. The rima glottis is the narrowest part of the cavity of the larynx, and its level corresponds with the bases of the arytenoid cartilages. Its length in the male is about 23 millimeters, in the female from 17 to 18 millimeters. The width and shape of the rima glottis vary with the movements of the vocal folds and arytenoid cartilages during respiration and phonation. In the condition of rest, that is, when these structures are uninfluenced by muscular action, as in quiet respiration, the intramembranous part is triangular, with its apex in front and its base behind, the latter being represented by a line about 8 millimeters long connecting the anterior ends of the vocal processes, while the medial surfaces of the arytenoids are parallel to each other, and hence the intercartilaginous part is rectangular. During extreme adduction of the vocal folds, as in the emission of a high note, the intramembranous part is reduced to a linear slit by the apposition of the vocal folds, while the intercartilaginous part is triangular, its apex corresponding to the anterior ends of the vocal processes of the arytenoids, which are approximated by the medial rotation of the cartilages. Conversely, in extreme abduction of the vocal folds, as in forced inspiration, the arytenoids and their vocal processes are rotated lateralward, and the intercartilaginous part is triangular in shape, but with its apex directed backward. In this condition the entire glottis is somewhat lozenge shaped, the sides of the intramembranous part diverging from before backward, those of the intercartilaginous part diverging from behind forward, the widest part of the aperture corresponding with the attachments of the vocal folds to the vocal processes. Muscles. The muscles of the larynx are extrinsic, passing between the larynx and parts around. These have been described in the section on myology, and intrinsic, confined entirely to the larynx. The intrinsic muscles are cricothyroideus, cricoarytenoideus posterior, cricoarytenoideus lateralis, arytenoideus, thyroarytenoideus. The cricothyroideus (cricothyroid), triangular in form, arises from the front and lateral part of the cricoid cartilage. Its fibers diverge and are arranged in two groups. The lower fibers constitute a pars obliqua and slant backward and lateralward to the anterior border of the inferior cornu. The anterior fibers, forming a pars recta, run upward, backward, and lateralward to the posterior part of the lower border of the lamina of the thyroid cartilage. The medial borders of the two muscles are separated by a triangular interval occupied by the middle cricothyroid ligament. The cricoarytenoideus posterior (posterior cricoarytenoid) arises from the broad depression on the corresponding half of the posterior surface of the lamina of the cricoid cartilage. Its fibers run upward and lateralward, and converge to be inserted into the back of the muscular process of the arytenoid cartilage. The uppermost fibers are nearly horizontal, the middle oblique, and the lowest almost vertical. The cricoarytenoideus lateralis (lateral cricoarytenoid) is smaller than the preceding, and of an oblong form. It arises from the upper border of the arch of the cricoid cartilage, and passing obliquely upward and backward, is inserted into the front of the muscular process of the arytenoid cartilage. The arytenoideus is a single muscle, filling up the posterior concave surfaces of the arytenoid cartilages. It arises from the posterior surface and lateral border of one arytenoid cartilage, and is inserted into the corresponding parts of the opposite cartilage. It consists of oblique and transverse parts. The arytenoideus obliquus, the more superficial, forms two fasciculi which pass